a game in an hour, but I have nothing planned.
I'm running a game in an hour and I only have 5 maps, 6 NPCs, and 12 side quests planned.
This is part 1 of a 2-part episode. Let's talk modules.
We'll need to dig into who should use them, how to use them for prepping or running a session, and if they work for everyone all the time.
Spoiler alert, they don't, but also they do. It's a whole thing.
Hey! I'm your host, Sarah, and
I'm your other host, Morgan.
We're 2 sisters
by marriage
who love to talk about stories.
From writing fiction and creating elaborate plot lines in D&D
to doing the bare minimum or the absolute most in prep.
We're
out of initiative. You might call it improv, but running and playing in a tabletop RPG requires a lot of thinking on your feet. But that's not to say you can go in without a plan, especially as a new GM. Let's discuss which pieces you should write and which you should wing.
Okay, I think the obvious place to start here is modules.
Yes. Yes.
I would recommend any new GM, especially if you're playing D&D. I should say my experiences in D&D. I would recommend any new DM start with an official module, right? We really enjoyed Dragon by Spire Peak, which we just finished, and I will love those characters forever. It revolves around a job board concept, which is, I think, really easy to manage. You have a pretty finite, first of all, you have a place where your players are constantly coming back for story beats, like what's next. And you have a finite number of directions to prep, right? Like they're most likely going to take one of these 3 items from the job board, and therefore you know which 3 things to have ready. 3 is still a lot, right? Like if that's too much, you can certainly say like only these ones are available right now, or you want to start that sounds great, gang. I haven't prepped that one, so folks, let's call it here, and then we'll come back next session, unless you guys want to do some shopping around town. There's nothing wrong with that, but I really think that starting with the module format helps you understand like what material do DMs typically refer to, what's typically on the page, because if you go in totally unaided, I do think one of my issues is that I would totally over prep. What's the ambient temperature? And if someone does druidcraft, what would the weather be tomorrow? You can really go down the rabbit hole. Like what's the loam percentage on the soil under the vendor's feet? Like it's really like you can go as far as you want, and it is often quite unproductive. So I think that you should start with the module. And then, from there you can decide, are modules what you like? Do you want to customize a module? Or are you someone like me who really doesn't like having to script things in advance? I really prefer full homebrew. And I'm glad that I ran a module first so that I could learn that was really just not for me.
Would you say for like new GMs, Dragon of Icespire Peak is a good module to start with because of, as you said, like the bounty board and all that?
Yeah.
In your opinion?
In my opinion, I think Dragon of Icespire Peak would be an amazing place to start. I'd recommend that to any new DM. I ran Waterdeep Dragon Heist, played Dragon of Icespire Peak, and ran Waterdeep Dragon Heist. Waterdeep Dragon Heist was fun, but like a city setting like that, like Phandalin, where Dragon of Icespire Peak is set, is very small. It's very manageable. It is, you have a pretty finite number of places where the players can go and things they can get into. Obviously, there's the surrounding area, but like the woods are the woods are the woods, and then you can go to the mountain, and the mountain is the mountain, right? Like there aren't that many different things. Whereas in Waterdeep, the like kind of beauty of Waterdeep Dragon Heist is that it's like a whole thriving world, and if you really want to dig into it, there's an entire wiki built that shows like who runs what businesses and where's that building located, and which let's talk about the fest halls of the dock ward, and here's an entire list. It's like, who made this list? Why does this exist? And if you're someone who wants that kind of material, like I want to be able to search for jewelers within Waterdeep, great, that exists, and you can pull it up. I found myself straying from it because I felt that it would be easier for me to remember something that I came up with in the moment because I could just take a note versus having to figure out what had been pre-written multiple times. So now that we're moving away from that, I'm really pleased that my campaign is kind of going into a direction that's fully homebrew versus something that someone else has already written. The other thing, I think we have one player who's read some of the books that are set in the region, so he actually has some context. And there's a pretty intimidating element for me to know that one of my players may know more about an area than I do. For me, it's like, well, then I'm like, I don't want to run that. Do you want to run it? Because I think I'm going to make a mistake. And while it is my world, and I know that this player, he would never say, well, actually, in the book, never in a million years would he do that. I still like in the back of my mind, I'm like, I'm not the subject matter expert here. Which is why for our next campaign, we've been talking about building will be fully homebrew from the ground up and built with the players involved. Like everyone is going to be involved with the world building so that we all have the same amount of information. And I think that's going to help for engagement, and it's also going to make prep a lot easier. That was a very long way to say yes.
I know, yeah, Phandalin has like 2 ends, right? And
I
I
think
know
there's
we
only
always put
one, and then
the
there's one that's like
Stonehill.
defunct.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean that's easy compared to Waterdeep has so many, so many.
Yeah.
And I get what you're saying about if someone's really familiar with the world, there's 2 factors that could be intimidating. One, not a lot of what you're gonna present to them is not a surprise anymore, which
True.
as a DM, like I love that revealing
Yeah.
and having them pull at threads and dig and learn and find out on their own versus they already kind of have that knowledge like, oh yeah, that's, you know. And then the second is like what if they do pull on something that's a really big deal in the lore or in the canon and you just don't know, like you just don't, you haven't really looked in, like I want to go to this specific store and talk to this specific NPC because I know something. Like you're, as a DM, you're not gonna, I mean, you're gonna have to like scramble and Google or hopefully have time or something, you know. Why are they so fixated on this? So that would be tough. That would be tough. I know running as I'm running Curse of Strahd right now, since it's such a popular module, there is a lot on the internet and a lot of just, I think even if you've never played Curse of Strahd as a player, you have a general idea of what it's about and yet, you know, and the themes. And so there is a little bit of that intimidation because most players are coming to it expecting like certain elements and aspects that they have already heard about or learned or whatever. And again, you want to try and keep it fresh or add the element of surprise. And I'm glad you touched on the homebrew in your world because as I'm looking through a module and I'm prepping and we're getting, say, the players are going to get to this certain encounter and they're going to meet these NPCs, I, as a DM, have to kind of immerse myself in what these NPCs' motivations are and what they need to tell the players, what they won't tell the players. And when you haven't created the characters yourself, that's really hard. That's really, really
Really hard.
hard.
Yeah.
Because how do I connect with an old man? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how do I portray that? How someone else wrote what they are going to say, their mannerisms, everything, and I have to really focus on how I can be that person. Because you know, we've discussed this, you know, your character's always like a part of you, like a little bit of you, and how can I be like that when I haven't created it and I didn't write this dialogue, I didn't, you know, come up with this backstory. How do I get a hold of it so I can present it the best I can? Where if you homebrew it, you're going to make all your own characters. You're going to come up with it. You're going to know in the back of your mind what their motivations are, how they would react to certain questions. So there's definitely a little challenge with a module that way, but I think it's honestly, it's kind of fun, like to flex a little bit of your muscles, to be given a script and play a character you wouldn't normally play, and kind of have to figure it out. So I think there is some learning curve to that when you have modules.
I think so too. And one challenge with some of the older modules, and Strahd is a perfect example.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let me juxtapose by saying what I see in the current one. So Dragon Spire Peak and in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, at the front of the book, there's like a little timeline. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. This is when the next chapter starts, and then here, and here's where you're going to go from there. In theory, the story will end with the players doing X, Y, Z. And what I found with Strahd when I tried running Strahd a couple of years ago, I found the story so confusing. It's super nonlinear, and I'm pretty delighted to be playing in your campaign as you run it because I couldn't retain any of it. And I'm like, gosh, I sure hope I can figure out what's going on in this story because I have like the general like idea. There's a vampire in your game is Stradia. I love that you made her a woman, and she's been here a really long time. And we're trapped here. And I don't know much of the story beyond that, despite repeatedly trying to read through the module to prep. So I'm going in pretty unprepared as a player, like without the sort of meta knowledge. And as a DM, I really struggled with that one. That was like, it was confusing and like layered. And how can I relay a story to a table full of players if I don't get it? And that's, I think, another element of why I prefer to write my own versus running something pre-made.
And Curse of Strahd, we've discussed this before. I did a lot of kind of prep research on, because it has been ran so many times by so many DMs. There is a wealth of knowledge on what's worked and what doesn't, and what players get hung up on, and what needs to be updated or tweaked or whatever. And I came across one post, and I wish I could remember who it was, that said to run it almost backwards. Instead of starting in Barovia, you start it in Kretska, which is on the other end of the map. And then you work it backwards that way. And then you end in Barovia. And then
makes sense.
Ravenloft, right? And so they were like talking about how it was so much better. It just felt like, because to go from Barovia to the Wizard of the Wines, or even Kretsk, is so far. A journey, and then to go all the back to Ravenloft. Like, there's just a lot of travel. And I know a lot of players don't like that, just traveling all the time. So this just felt like a really more organic way to run it. And then you end in Barovia, and then you end with Ravenloft. And then I've included some other elements, like making the gyms more important than they are in the module. They have some importance, but they're just kind of like a side lore thing. And I'm making them a lot more weighted. And because ultimately it's so clear with Curse of Strahd, you want to escape. Like, your whole goal is to get past the mist and escape. And so it's amazing that it's built such a clear goal for your players. It immediately unifies them. Immediately, like, I just need to survive and get home. And I just love that it's so contained, with great motivation. So that's been really fun. But yeah, when you have some of those modules that are more popular, like Dragon Spire Peak, there's a wealth of knowledge on either the Reddit or whatever, how I ran this encounter and why I got rid of this one. And it's amazing. It's amazing. And a lot of support from modules, where homebrew, you're kind of on your own. It's your world. So there is nothing. There is no support. How do I run this encounter? And did I make this too hard? Did I make this too easy? And so it is, I would highly recommend a more advanced, experienced DM. If you're going straight homebrew, you can always homebrew some of the modules. I know they always encourage that.
Just like taking bits and pieces and turning it into something new.
Yeah. Or like
require a lot of
reading,
though.
Yes,
and I
it
hate
does.
That. I hate that. Like, I love to read, and also don't make me. Don't tell me what to do.
I've read the module at least, like, 3. I'm probably 3 encounters ahead of where my players are right now. Mulling in the back of my mind. I'm reading. I'm watching YouTubes on it, how I'm going to run it. I'm looking at maps and how they're different. I'm maybe like 4 encounters ahead. And that's, and I'm not saying like I have maps prepared, but like, it's mentally, I'm prepping. And I know, like, how long would you say you prep per hour of gameplay? Because it's interesting. I saw a post on this on Twitter the other day, and it
really depends.
Yeah. Would you say
Oh, it
average?
really depends. So for our regular 3-hour session of gameplay, what I've been doing, I was actually pulling up some of my notes for sessions lately, because we're pretty deep into the story at this point. What I've been doing is like upcoming session, these are the story beats I'm hoping to get to. And sometimes that'll just be a 15-minute where are we, what are we working on exercise, and then maybe a couple of maps, which if I'm not making my maps, right, because I don't always make my maps, I subscribe to a bunch of Patreon accounts, I'm a patron to a bunch of Patreon things, because there are a lot of really brilliant map makers who have already made things that are frankly much more artistically developed than anything I could ever do. So great, I have a resource. I don't need to spend a lot of time making maps. But if I have something really specific in mind and I need to make the map, it's going to take a lot longer. So I might spend at the peak of the story knowing I have a lot of maps to prepare, knowing I have a lot to work through, and staying away from over preparing. I could easily spend 2 hours preparing for every hour of gameplay.
Yeah, the post I said was an hour for every 2 hours of gameplay. Is what they
Yeah,
said.
that sounds about right.
So,
I have spent many a full Saturday
mhm.
before a 3-hour Sunday game, and I have to say I enjoy it, and that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I enjoy the prep because on the weeks when I don't enjoy it, it's work, and that's not very fun for me.
Mhm.
So I'll specifically make sure that the party is going in a direction. I'll choose a map that's already made and make sure that the party is getting plot hooks that I don't have to spend so much energy producing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm just kind of looking at some of my notes. It's like
But and
the
to be
party's going
clear,
to receive a message and it'll sound like this.
this part of the campaign where we are is all homebrew. So you're spending 2
100%,
hours.
yeah.
Yeah, so you're spending 2 hours for 1 hour of gameplay.
In more intense sessions, yeah. And then in sessions where like where we're at right now, we're so deep into the story.
Mhm, mhm.
Um No, you know what? It's probably still one to one. Now that I'm thinking about it, as I'm like, oh yeah, I still have an Ullivan map to make. Um, it's probably an hour for every
Okay,
hour of
so
gameplay.
when we were in Waterdeep doing Waterdeep adjacent quests, how much prep did those take?
It's such a good question. So when we were in Waterdeep during homebrew stuff that was happening within the city, so the world has already been generated
Mhm.
by Wizards of the Coast, but what the story itself is homebrew. Um, sometimes I could do like 30 minutes of prep for every hour of gameplay. So we're talking that ratio you were talking about, 1 hour of prep for every two
Yeah,
hours of gameplay. That
yeah.
sounds about right. Yeah.
So it felt reduced when you had more assets already available and
I think so. You guys were also visiting a lot of the same places, talking to the same
mhm.
NPCs. And then some sessions, I'm trying to find some of my like better notes.
That's a benefit of Waterdeep Dragon Heist is because a lot of it you're gonna stay in town for a long time. Where like Curse of Strahd, you're just all the time moving. Like rarely are you gonna
Yeah.
come back. I mean, maybe, but probably not.
Yeah, when the
So
party's traveling and I need
yeah,
travel maps, I would do like a camp map. You know, like, oh, you made camp and it's the same kind of camp map you've made before. I have on one occasion recycled a map too soon. And multiple players were like, "Oh, hey, we've been here before." And I was like, "Damn it. No.
did I say
This is a
that?
new
Did I notice?
No, I think it
I
was
didn't.
Chris and Kyle.
I
I'll throw
didn't
them under the
notice.
bus.
It's
Like, "Oh,
first
hey, we
time
know
around the
this one."
fishbowl for me. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
I,
Wow,
I'm
cool,
just happy
great.
to be here.
Um
I
so like
think our airship, like we're always on the airship,
yeah, you guys
and
spend a lot of
so
time on the airship.
so
That's
you're
like the best
reusing
worst
that.
thing I've ever given you guys because on one hand you're like we can go anywhere and sometimes it takes a couple of days to travel. So I have like a air combat map that I use all the time because like
Yeah.
from the air it's going to look the same. The map makes sense that the map would be the
Yep.
same. I just put new
Yep.
tokens on there. And that is here's my little behind the screen moment. Um anytime you guys are on the airship lately, anytime you guys have been on the airship and then something attacks you or some sort of encounter happens, it's because I do not feel prepared for the next section. And I'm like, ooh, you know what we could do though? I've got that combat. We could just So that near TPK recently with the all those
The death
tentacled
kisses.
creatures, the death
Yes.
kisses
Oh my
and the
gosh.
gazer.
Yeah.
That was me biding time. I was just trying to figure out what you guys were gonna do next, and I was like, well, every time I throw a hard encounter at you or a deadly encounter at you, it doesn't seem to make a difference. You guys are really just like powering right on through. So it's like I should do something harder. I should do a harder encounter. And the abilities to have so many characters fail saving throws
Mhm.
in a
Mhm.
row and then end up just that was brutal. It was
And
really,
when
really
you're on
brutal.
airship, a lot of us can fly, but not all of us. And when you're on an
Not all of
airship,
you.
there's the big added risk of falling along with
Um,
getting attacked. So,
yeah, and for the
yeah.
2 characters who can fly because they are winged, they do
Mhm.
not fall safely to the ground. So paralysis,
Yes.
or falling unconscious while in the air means you are toppling to the ground. I hope you make your death saves. Like,
Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
no. Yeah, we've had some really interesting moments. It's really like that putting the players in a situation of extreme challenge has created some extreme creativity, I will say.
Yes. Yes, it does.
I've grabbed some of my recent notes. Here's
Yeah.
my session prep lately. I go session plan and then a date and then whatever city you guys are in. So in this instance, you guys were in Daggerford.
Mhm.
And I made a note that was like, okay, pick up right here. Like 2 or 3 sentences of what's going on. What message Zila was going to receive. One of the characters receives a message, several messages from her sister, and then some conversation that might be heard through a magic ring of sending. And then I had like one character. This is a really funny one for me to have grabbed. You get this note from someone named Freeman. You received a voice in your head from someone named Freeman who asked if his pet goblin delivered your note and then said to stay out of trouble and that he wouldn't want to see you getting in trouble, or finding yourself in danger. Um, and that was like it was like, oh, it was a character that I hope is memorable for you, and I'm realizing now that I don't know that the connection was ever made. And then I had like a list of like, oh, here are people you guys might run into. Emmeline is a cart driver, transportation. Her name might be noted somewhere. Dionysa is an unemployed bartender. Philippa and Pavia are haulers and movers. Like just like a list of like name and what they do, and I didn't have anything more fleshed out than that. Because I didn't know if you guys were going to interact with them. And then you didn't. You only interact with Issel, the advisor. Um,
Mhm.
so it was
Mhm.
like keeping it really, really simple. This was probably 15 to 30 minutes of prep for an entire 3-hour session.
That's good. That's
I
really
think that's
good.
pretty good.
But how long have
So,
you been DMing at
so
this point?
consistently, yeah, we've been playing weekly for 3 straight years. Plus, I have experience from before that, like from with the game
Mhm.
and as a
Mhm.
writer. So, I certainly wouldn't recommend that for everybody. So, what should we be prepping then?
Prep is a whole other conversation.
Let's talk more about what you should write and what you should wing in part 2.
In the meantime, we've been out of initiative, but we're going to get back into it. So get out there, roll some dice, tell some stories, and we will see you in part 2.
Thanks for listening to Out of Initiative, a podcast from Merely NPCs. For more from Sarah and Morgan, follow them on TikTok at Merely NPCs or visit them online at merelynpcs.com.